Hello, everyone. My name is Stephen Steck. I'm a senior research fellow, and I'm the lead researcher on environment and democracy at the CU Democracy Institute. And I'm very happy to be here and to be able to introduce Noemi Gonda, who actually is our first presenter in a seminar by our work group. So it's an auspicious occasion for us, and I'm glad it's you because your subject is extremely interesting. The topic today is authoritarian populism and natural resources depletion, land grabbing, and climate politics in Hungary and Nicaragua. And Noemi is an illustrious graduate of our university. She got her PhD here, and her research was feminist ethnography, which focused on the politics of gender and climate change in Nicaragua. He's now at the Department of Urban and Rural Development at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. And between 2017 and 2020, she was a postdoctoral researcher on social and ecological justice at the Department of Urban and Rural Development under the mentorship of Professor Andrea Nightingale.
Who's here present.
Who is here present. Okay, wonderful, welcome. Our discussant today is going to be Professor Alexios Antipas. We were talking about the fact that we worked together in the Department of Environmental Sciences and Policy for over 20 years. And Professor Antipas has a specialty in environmental governance, particularly international environmental governance and policy. And he's this year a research affiliate with us at the Democracy Institute in the Environment and Democracy Work Group. His broad areas of expertise are in environmental policy and global environmental governance, as I mentioned, and he served as a consultant to the United Nations Environment Program, UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, the World Health Organization, the European Committee of the Regions, and various agencies of the United States government. So he's going to be our discussant, and what we shall do today is have first a presentation by Noemi Gonda, and then we'll have a response from our discussant, Professor Antipas, and then I will open the floor for questions and discussion from the participants. I will keep an eye on the chat, and we have, I think, plenty of time, and it looks like we have a nice group between the people here and those who are online, so I'm anticipating we'll have a great discussion. So now, without further ado, I will give the floor to Noemi Gonda.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here, and it always feels like coming home, even if CU, like the university where I studied, is not here anymore, but in Vienna. But yeah, so I'm going to share my screen and start. Start with what I would like to say, and I would like also to, to state that this is based on previous research, some ongoing research, and also very much on research in progress. So, your questions and critiques will be really important to have to take this further. So how does authoritarian populism fuel natural resources depletion and vice versa? As I think we all agree, constructing environmentally sustainable and democratic political regime constitutes the most important political challenge of our time, marked by the proliferation of authoritarian populism and the effects of climate change. So my research aims to address this double challenge by trying to put the question of environmental governance into a broader question of, or into a broader debate of democracy. My empirical research is situated in authoritarian populist regimes in Nicaragua and Hungary, these undemocratic political regimes that, among other things, invest efforts in creating false binaries between us and them in order to construct a seemingly popular consent behind authoritarian politics. So my focus is on how environmental politics help to create this popular concept, these binaries and this consent, as well as for whom and at which price. Important for my approach is that authoritarian populist regimes are chameleonic and even hypocritical, or what I want to say is that, or better say, their politics are chameleonic and even hypocritical, contradictory and ambiguous. And in my research, I find useful to understand and engage with the contradictions and ambiguities of authoritarian populist politics as one avenue for thinking about emancipation, or let's call it transformation if you want, the way out, which I understand in the feminist political ecology tradition as a process of building commons, well-being, affective and caring relations with humans and non-humans, as well as equity, justice, and democracy. So let's go first to Nicaragua, an authoritarian populist regime whose consolidation by former Sandinista Comandante Daniel Ortega, the president now, I have witnessed firsthand. Indeed, I have lived in Nicaragua between 2002 and 2010, when I was working with farmers' organizations and indigenous groups there, and later when I did my PhD between 2012 and 2016, my research was on the politics of gender and climate change there. So the Nicaraguan authoritarian regime has been very successful in mobilizing contradictions and ambiguities in relation to environmental governance. And it is in part because of these ambiguities that for long, international opinion has been split between supporting the opposition and the Nicaraguan government. So as the Nicaraguan government has been self-described as socialist Sandinista, post-neoliberal, and promoting buen vivir, there has been a lot of misunderstanding surrounding its opponents, with some qualifying them as neoliberal, derechista, right-wing, supported by the US, and anti-revolutionary. Indeed, this concept of buen vivir that the Nicaraguan government has been extracting from all its essence and institutionalizing is a worldview that implies harmony and balance with the various dimensions of the human being. Its pillars are harmony with nature, respect of the values and the principles of indigenous people, and satisfaction of basic needs, social justice and equality as responsibilities of the state, as well as democracy. So the example in Nicaragua of the Interoceanic Canal project, this mega project supposed to connect the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific one, illustrates well the process through which the narratives of justice, equity, national sovereignty, and social responsibility have been constructed around this mega project, and the difficulty that opponents of the project have faced over years to highlight the injustices behind this pseudo buen vivir approach. So in 2014, the Nicaraguan government gave a 100-year concession to a Chinese billionaire to build an interoceanic canal, like the Panama Canal. And if implemented, this mega project would not only cause environmental damage to the biggest lake in Central America, Lake Cocibolca, but also would affect forest resources, including the Indio Maize Reserve, which is called the lung of the Central American region. It would, of course, deprive indigenous groups from their rivers and their land. Since the first declarations about the canal in 2013, justice has been central to the governmental narrative, with two main arguments. The first argument was that of the social responsibility of the Chinese company that was supposed to construct or execute the project. So the Chinese company, and I cite here governmental communication, was acting in the name of the common good in order to face poverty, provide labor, and guarantee the social well-being of the Nicaraguan people. The second argument that framed the canal as a just project related to historical justice. The canal's foreseen economic and environmental benefits were presented as something that the government, the regime, ought to give back to its citizens, especially to those who were eager to sacrifice their lives for Nicaragua during the Sandinista revolution of the 1980s. So the narrative conveyed an idea of gratefulness in both ways. The government, was giving this mega project to the citizens because it was grateful to its supporters, and its supporters should be grateful for the government's, support. And all those who were questioning the regime's good intentions were depicted as enemies. So when I was doing field research 10 years ago in Nicaragua, the regime, I'm trying to click, and it's not advancing. Yes. The regime had not yet become as violent and repressive as now. There are hundreds of thousands of Nicaraguan, in political exile. There are hundreds of them in jail as political prisoners. Still 10 years ago, the regime was slowly building up, relying on these ambiguities to implement its pseudo-transformative socio-environmental politics and projects. For example, at the local level, the government programs were distributing goods to those people who were constructed by the narrative as the most vulnerable, such as, for example, rural women, but who were, of course, also supporters of the Sandinista party. These goods were, for example, zinc plates for roof construction, pigs for backyard farming, medical treatment for the sick who cannot afford it. This narrative and the practice were described by a feminist leader I interviewed back then as part of a system of subordination that recalls colonial time. She stated, and this is a long quote, apologies, but I still like it very much. She states about this practice and this narrative: this is a culture of gratitude towards the one who gives. It is an inherited culture of excessive personalization of leadership, very post-colonial. It's a culture in which the boss is good because he cares about me. He gives things to my children. He takes care of me on the farm. He's concerned with giving me a bed in better state, a small house to live in. There's no questioning of the relationship of exploitation because the boss is good. This relationship has been maintained through the cultural model of the Sandinista front. It reproduces the colonial farm in big, the boss, the commander, who cares for one's property, gives one school, gives her a piggy. One has the right to go with others to participate in Sunday celebrations, participate as 50% of the population, she's referring as women, but don't touch the great power relations, neither the power of capital nor the political power. Beyond setting up the binaries between the people ought to be protected by the regime, such as vulnerable women in the case of Nicaragua, but of course only the pro-Ortega ones, this type of pseudo pro-gender equality measures helped to legitimize the regime at the international level too. Ironically, the World Economic Forum is still currently ranking Nicaragua, this super repressive dictatorship, as the 7th most gender equal country in the world. And this is in great part related to the fact that women are still numerically present, and I add institutionalized in the government as 30% at the national and the local levels. They are also instrumentalized in environmental policy documents. I have never in my life seen a national climate change adaptation strategy that was as gendered as the Nicaraguan one, women in the policy paper and in the consequent actions are presented as, as the potential saviors in the face of climate change, and also as the most vulnerable population groups who are to be, protected and who need to be the first beneficiaries of the projects. Okay, so all resemblance with another country or another country's possible future is product of your imagination. So, authoritarian environmental and agrarian politics in Hungary also rely on narratives of transformation, which sound emancipatory and aligned with building consent around noble objectives, while in reality serving the purpose of putting forward business as usual solutions. And also, alienating, subjugating, and oppressing in the name of transformative concept. In Hungary, in recent research carried out with Peter Bori, who's a PhD student at CU, we also tried to delve into the contradictions and ambiguities behind what we call the three rural pillars of authoritarian, populist, environmental, agricultural politics. These three rural pillars and the ambiguities we investigate with Peter are unequal land relations, EU subsidies, and agricultural commodity sales. And I'm going to, say a few words about these three. So here in Hungary, we know that rural inhabitants are the main voters of Prime Minister Orbán's party Fidesz, who won the elections in 2010 by pledging to stand up for Hungarian smallholder farmers' rights, who at that time were facing land grabbing scandals that had been revealed a few months prior to the elections. So in 2010, Orbán strategically used some land grab related conflicts to win rural voters. He exposed the so-called pocket contracts that helped foreigners acquire land rights in Hungary despite the 2004 land moratorium. So his political campaign in the rural areas with farmers made exceptional efforts to rely them by supporting the elaboration of a rural development strategy that all of us would qualify as emancipatory. Indeed, that strategy was supposed to encourage dynamic, small-scale production systems by leasing out state-owned land. At that time, there was quite a lot, to young Hungarian families who were ready to settle in the countryside in order to revitalize it. So, of course, you may have guessed already that that strategy has never been implemented, and it ended up like literally in the dustbin, as it was only used to win some strategic rural voters or votes. And later, we know the story here in Hungary in 2014 and 2018, Orbán didn't need these rural votes anymore, or not as much as the election system had been already changed, and he also managed at that time to rely on traditional far-right voters that were used to vote for the far-right party. In 2015, the thunderstorm land privatization process. So you remember I said that at that time in 2010 there was still a lot of agricultural land in the hands of the state. But in 2015, there was a thunderstorm land privatization process, thunderstorm because it was very quick, and it contributed to the decrease by 30% of Hungarian small farms. Privatizing Hungarian agricultural land in 2015 during the so-called refugee crisis, so it was in summer 2015, that kept Hungarian people's mind occupied, was clearly meant to control and please Orbán's oligarchs, these political economic elite that support the regime. Of course, the strategy had been prepared much earlier, 2-3 years or earlier to 2015, because the land privatization process was supposed to prioritize former land leasers. Some lease contracts had been given to Orban supporters a few years before 2015. But why is agricultural land interesting for the Orban regime's oligarchs? There's a long-term and a short-term reason. The long-term reason is speculation on land prices. There is this threat of an infringement procedure from the EU against Hungary, obligating the country to liberalize its agricultural land market, something that Hungary has been reticent to do for a few years. In the moment of this liberalization, the wealthiest Hungarians who will have land will be happy to sell this agricultural land to foreigners. If you compare agricultural land prices, in Hungary with the land prices in France or Holland, or you can multiply. You can multiply it with quite a few. It's much more expensive in Western Europe. In addition, if the land market gets truly liberalized in Hungary, Orban will most probably blame the EU, thus fueling this anti-EU sentiments of his right-wing voters. And the short-term reason for agricultural land being interesting for Orban's supporter is the Common Agricultural Program's subsidies. Of course, they don't want to farm, or most of them don't want to farm, but they are happy to get incomes through the area-based subvention schemes. So the just mentioned reasons justify why I say that the EU's land policy and Common Agriculture Program are fueling Hungarian authoritarian populism, in the meantime that the EU is conveniently blamed by the Orban regime and its allies as being anti-Hungarian. So this was the second pillar. And the third one, agricultural commodity sales. So an additional feature of the post-socialist epoch's agricultural landscape is the dominance of these so-called integrators. These integrators are now owned by some of the country's wealthiest businessmen and operate mainly as trade organizations, agriculture trade organizations. For instance, Kite, the country's largest, is owned by Sándor Csányi on the left here, Hungary's wealthiest person, and Lőrinc Mészáros, this gentleman on the right, this infamous gas feature-grown billionaire and childhood friend of Orban, also entered the integrator business and owns one that is called AgroLink. So generally thought as companies supposed to help out farmers in need, integrators supply farmers with inputs such as seeds, manure, pesticides, and so on, and subsequently purchase post-harvest production from them. And while this contractual agreement arrangement provides some security for the farmers, transactions are frequently done at below market prices, and the pre-harvest contract often leaves farmers unable to exit these exploitative cycles. Integrators contribute to farmers' alienation, dependence, and to the disintegration of the relations of solidarity, proximity, and care towards other humans and non-humans that characterize traditional peasant society. But in our interviews with people working for integrators, so not the owners, the people, the technicians who work, these integrators were praised as key associations, providing farmers with security for commercialization, advice for production, and even as a means to contribute to maintaining or for the survival of the uncompetitive smallholder farmers. Yet we argue that these integrators or organizations only sound like emancipatory alliances. In reality, these alliances are controlled by these wealthy oligarchs and are underpinned by a neoliberal and capitalist production model. Energy politics in Hungary. This is my last example, and yeah, it's a very hot topic now. So concerning energy politics, Hungary seems to be again a paradigmatic example that highlights the entanglements, the ambiguities, the contradictions of power processes. The Hungarian government's opposition, or at least lack of support to renewables and support to nuclear energy, can be explained by renewables like solar energy's lack of point of central control. So a mega project like the expansion of the nuclear plant of Paks can and need to be controlled centrally. As you may know, in 2015, the Russian company Rosatom was given an impressive more than 12 billion euros contract to build 2 additional reactors. And in 2023, the Hungarian government still treats the project of Paks as feasible, despite the EU sanctions to Russia. We need to know that the nuclear plant of Paks today provides 40% of the Hungarian energy supply. And in the government's discourse and the government supporters discourse, the nuclear plant of Paks for nuclear energy is considered as a clean energy and a stable energy. A stability, and when they talk about the stability, they claim that this is the type of stability that cannot be obtained with renewables such as solar energy, but that is also immune to the price volatility associated with gas-fired plants. So most probably the amplification of the Paks power plant will remain at the level of the narrative in Hungary, yet it shows energy politics embeddedness in social, cultural, and political struggles, in addition to constituting eco-technical transformations. And and all this narrative, all these ambiguities are only delaying the energy transition that we needed in the context of climate change. So while nuclear energy represents stability and cleanness in the Hungarian national narrative, in recent years, ironically, EU energy transition objectives have been reached by Hungary thanks to solid fuel users. So by solid fuel, I mean firewood, coal, and briquettes that are used by the forest people in Hungary, the so-called energy poors. 1/5 of Hungarian households rely exclusively on solid fuels. These are these low-income households inhabiting some of the worst performing building stock. And ironically, wood is considered as a renewable, even if research shows in Hungary, this is not my research, that the poorest in Hungary do not source wood from regulated forest exploitations. So thus, ironically, again, it seems that because these poor people heat and cook with wood and coal, maintaining them in that state of energy poverty helps reaching EU energy transition objectives in Hungary. Of course, we know heating systems of these energy poors are obsolete, contaminating for the environment, and harmful for human health. Another example is the pilot project implemented this is very recent, in the poor village of Tisztabő in Hungary. This is a small village of 2,000 inhabitants. This is praised in the governmental narrative. This is also governmental media as the socially just energy transition project supported by the government. So what happened is that basically E.ON, which is the national electricity company, together with the pro-regime NGO, Máltai Szeretett Szolgálat, has built a huge solar panel park on the territory of this village, Tisztabő. And this is another problematic use of agricultural land. So 12 families of the village, the ones that have children under 3 years old, have the right to a certain amount of kilowatt per month for heating purpose that they don't need to pay for. But the project still belongs to E.ON, the energy company. The profits are made by E.ON, and the national NGO sells the project as a model for fighting energy poverty, while all it does is that it uses the village's land for the solar park and gives some breadcrumbs at best to some of the inhabitants. Of course, in the summer months when heating is not needed, the energy produced is directed elsewhere and the local population does not benefit from it in any forms. So we have looked up now who's behind E.ON, the national energy company. You can guess. It's again Orban's friend Mészáros is involved and other oligarchs. So this is all for all these reasons. I argue that we need to repoliticize environmental or energy democracy. In recent years, there's this notion of energy democracy in particular have proliferated in reference to ongoing energy transitions in the face of climate change. And this is often used, energy democracy is often used as a buzzword for political purposes, and it is mostly associated with the increase in the role of prosumers, these citizens who both consume and produce renewable energy, or energy cooperatives or local governments and collectives control of functions earlier fulfilled by energy companies. Yet there is some kind of local and participation bias in this understanding of energy democracy, which I think should be overcome because we need to rethink energy democracy and environmental democracy beyond its local meaning and try to put it at a higher level of into a debate of democratic governance. So this would require, and this is a bit what I'm trying to do or will try to do, unpacking how environmental governance in general, or energy transition policies in particular, projects can reinforce existing hierarchies, existing intersectional hierarchies, and the interest of a privileged political economic elite. It would also require exploring the role of democracy, how it can play, what role it can play in fostering environmental politics, energy transition, and find an advocate on the linkages between environmental politics, energy transition policies, and the building and consolidation of democracy beyond their local and participation bias. So in my research in Nicaragua and Hungary, I tried to illustrate why environmental governance needs to be resituated in a broader debate on democracy, and how focusing on these contradictions I tried to highlight can help peering through the cracks of authoritarian populist environmental politics. And these cracks are in this type of countries, super repressive countries like Nicaragua, only headline fractures, yet they need attention. So for example, and we write about this in this publication with my colleagues, in Nicaragua, in the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Nicaraguan government's initial strategy was to dismiss the threat of the disease, encouraging people to gather. In response to that, indigenous and Afro-descendant communities along the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua implemented territorial self-quarantines appealing to the principles of autonomy and self-determination, which are really important for indigenous people. So in this regard, members of the indigenous territorial government have demanded that state institutions and tourists avoid their territory. This was contrary to the discourse and the practice of the central government, asked, for mass events to be organized. And in Carawala, which is this community, a self-quarantine fisher agriculture indigenous community, called for solidarity under the slogan, "If the virus does not kill us, starvation will." The Nicaraguan government, in response to this type of counter-movements of voluntary confinement, has been the militarization of the community. Still, we argue in this paper that this type of counter-initiatives that have emerged in the face of crisis and in response to repression require further scrutiny because they bear the potential to pave the way for something bigger and a more radical change. And similarly, in the forthcoming paper, I already mentioned with the body, we discuss how alternative farming practices in Hungary can become emancipatory. So by alternative farming practices, we mean those potentially emancipatory practices that can help change our ways of thinking, our desires, habits, and modes of being with the land and others. And we start from this hypothesis that this alternative farming, such as community-supported agriculture, permaculture, and small-scale regenerative farming, can become prefigurative of a new world and can help rethinking sustainability in the countryside. Indeed, these alternative farming practices help to think differently about proximity relations and care towards the land. As for example, close relations between producers and consumers entail building and maintaining affective relations as opposed to exploitative ones on which today's dominant food industry relies. So that is what I wanted to say today. And again, this is ongoing research, and I'm very much looking forward to your comments and gentle critique. Thank you.
Oh, so first, wow, I mean, that was really a lot of material and very interesting. And we're going to now turn to our discussants. I did come up with a couple of questions for after Alex has his shot. And I'm hoping that our participants are also thinking about some questions that they would like to ask. So I think to get the discussion going, we turn to Alex Antipas now, the discussant, to react to this presentation.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Noemi. Really interesting presentation, and your papers are very interesting. Thank you for sending them to me. And that has led to a lot of reflection on my part. And one of my reactions is simply that because we're in this, period globally of massive disruption and transition away from every aspect of the world that we know, the post-Second World War order, economically, we are in tremendous transition. Technologically, it's incomprehensible, really, how rapidly we're transitioning away from the kind of industrial model that we were used to. And of course, ecologically, we're in a massive transition that we barely understand. We have some knowledge of, but we know it's also extremely disruptive to ourselves and the planet. And an inquiry like yours is, it's the microcosm that represents the macrocosm, and therefore has a universal kind of significance. And I really appreciate that. and case studies. This are very, very important for us to think about how, what's going on actually globally. And you also say that, but we also have to scale up. I mean, for instance, when you're talking about energy democracy and so on, scale up our thinking from the local as well. And I think that's absolutely correct. So first, I would just have some kind of softball questions, things that I was wondering about, and then just some remarks about these changes and the extraordinarily difficult, I think, beyond complexity problems that we face, wicked problems, but kind of a level higher than wicked problems at this point. So some of the first questions are simply thinking about Nicaragua, and this question comes out of my ignorance. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think you probably know much more because you have such a deep history in Nicaragua. What are the social and economic conditions that have allowed for the rise of such a repressive government in Nicaragua, and how does it compare to what has happened in neighboring countries? In other words, why does Nicaragua stand apart? To the extent that it does. Right? And I think that the same question applies to Hungary. For me, I've been a resident of Hungary for over 20 years. In that sense, I'm a close observer, but I don't have a very good answer to that. So, the conditions. On the question of alternative agriculture, this is another question. I guess you'll just break these down and address them. What you said, it sounds very nice and it sounds very idealistic, and but it also sounds utopian. And so I want to know, how is it not? How is it not utopian? How is it not fantastical? And how can these forms of more, if I was being cynical, I'd say these, more back to the earth kind of forms of agriculture deal with the problem of scale that, that we actually have. And I'm not hostile at all. I go to the bio market, and I support small farmers. And if I had land, I would grow my own food as well. My wife's family does grow their own food in Romania. I think you're absolutely right. But it's kind of like, to me, I mean, my first reaction, I was like, well, in China, they have entire cities, tens of millions of people living in, 50-story, 80-story high rises. There's no capacity. You have to supply everything, energy, materials, food, in industrial scale. There's just no other way to feed and to take care of their needs. So how do you deal with that? So I wanted to address the energy transition a little bit more, and because you had me thinking about it, and I've been thinking about the energy transition for a while as well, and I'm extremely uncomfortable with it. But the larger context, of course, is this age of, I don't know what you want to call it, right, of compounding crises. I mean, we're no longer in, I think, arguably something that fits the definition of the risk society. We're past that, and we're in a kind of space of ignorance. On the one hand, I think that for me, the paradigmatic example of the ignorance that the space of ignorance that we're in is artificial intelligence. When the labs that are creating, GPT-4, working on GPT-5, the scientists are completely clueless about what happens inside those networks. They have no idea, none, zero. Nobody knows anything. How does, GPT-4 produce what it's producing? They don't know. They only create conditions for those networks to be able to work, but the complexity is way beyond human scale, and so they haven't any clue. They can't even, we already have people saying, well, could be sentient, but we wouldn't know. We can't know. And of course, some philosophers say it's impossible, whatever, but the point is, don't know. So, and that's something that we are creating. And of course, the compounding crises. And we're also ignorant we're not that ignorant about climate change, but how does climate change interact with resource depletion or with, movements of people, or with changing economic conditions, or with the rise of authoritarian populism around the world? We don't know. We can just only speculate, right? So I think that's our situation. Now, on the energy transition, and this is where, because you had you showed this solar farm in some complexity. You didn't say, the message wasn't, this is a good thing, right? Mm-hmm. But you have, because why it's a part of this kind of oligarchical system that has been established in Hungary, and it's a bit of a show. Its real purpose is something else, and that's good to point that out. But you do mention that the energy transition is necessary, and I think the question that you're raising is, how can it be emancipatory? How can it benefit us? But the energy transition, I just threw together a handful of kind of biophysical facts about the energy transition that I want to throw out there, and then link them to social and political possible outcomes or likely outcomes. Because the energy transition, like your solar, to me, the energy transition, like your solar farm in the village, is a bit of a show, because we're not going from brown fossil fuels to clean energy. It couldn't be anything further from the truth, and not in any way. So solar, wind, and even batteries, or EVs, electric vehicles, and every other battery-powered thing in solar and wind are far from it. I mean, I don't think we can make the argument that they're better than this. So with the average electric vehicle, if you take it, just that technology, comes to your doorstep the moment you buy it, before you step on the accelerator. It's already got embodied 25 tons of hydrocarbons in the production of, and this is the key issue. The key issue is the materials that go into all of those. 25 tons. You have to drive a Tesla about 100,000 kilometers before you start to get any CO2 benefit. And by the time you junked it, you've gotten about, and it's meaningful, but only about a 20% benefit over, your diesel. But if you can keep your diesel, if I can keep my diesel as I drive a diesel SUV, embarrassingly enough, but it's not really, if I can keep that on the road for 20 years, 25 years, it's going to be much less impactful on the climate if I buy myself a Tesla and throw that thing on the junk heap. But it gets even worse. If you look at the basket of minerals that would go, we now get about 3% of global energy from wind, solar, and batteries. 3%, which is about a third of what we get from wood. We're talking about the whole world now. But we need the basket of minerals, a couple of thousand different minerals. Of course, there's some really big ones like lithium and copper and so on. But you need between 1,000 and 2,000% more materials to go into those technologies, to build those, to replace any kind of hydrocarbon fueled turbine. But that's even worse. That's just for the energy output potential. But because solar and wind are intermittent, you need up to 7,000, 2 to 7,000 times more, because you have to build far more arrays. And that doesn't even take account of the land impacts, the massive land impacts and everything else. But it gets even worse, because where do those minerals come from? They're not going to come from Europe, and they're not going to come from the United States. They're going to come primarily from Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia. We're also completely dependent, for instance, on rare earths, on China, but on some of those other minerals on Russia. In other words, highly authoritarian states that we haven't had some problems with at the moment. But depending upon which, mineral you look at. I mean, I was looking up lithium. Actually, it's Australia, so we're okay. If you, think that's okay. Cobalt, that's the Democratic Republic of Congo mostly, and Russia. Graphite is China, nickel is Indonesia, Philippines, and Russia. Rare earths for China, Vietnam, Brazil, and Russia. At the moment, and of course you can shift some of that around, but this is you need global supply chains, and you need massive. So the International Energy Agency has said, that we need hundreds upon hundreds of new mines around the world in order to do the energy transition. Who's going to do that? It's very capital intensive. It's going to be Rio Tinto. I looked up, the list of the world's biggest mining companies. They're British, American, Canadian, Australian. They're the ones that we love. They go into indigenous communities, they create these massive mines. But we need so much of this stuff that you can't. There's no artisanal mining. We need the biggest industrial mining kind of, war on the earth that we could even imagine. And we need hundreds of them. But unfortunately, it takes about 16 years to gear a big mine up anyway at the moment. So the ambition that we're setting ourselves up for and the reality is really not yet aligned, right? And final kind of piece of how can it get worse puzzle is that, of course, with the demand massively increasing and the supply being slow. So the 16 years, what's going to happen with the price is going to go up. It's going to go up. I mean, so I've seen mineral economists are predicting that, okay, we're starting to push inflation down now, right, with higher interest rates, and so on. But that's only going, if we continue with the energy transition, that only lasts 2 or 3 more years. So because of the scaling up of production. So to me, the energy transition looks like the most capitalist, kind of top-down, corporate, and in need of more authoritarian government, actually, set of projects that, as you can imagine. Not for Europeans and Americans, for Australians and New Zealanders. We're going to get, so we can kind of buy our democracy, but for everybody. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's not the world we're particularly interested in. So how can the energy transition, my question is, how can the energy transition possibly help us achieve a more just or equitable world, given this material reality? Those are my questions.
Okay. That's a lot to digest, and we are covering a lot of ground today. It's amazing, actually, the kinds of things that we're trying to deal with here. So, are you ready to go to try to respond to these?
Yeah, and I'm not going to, to respond, to be able to respond. I wish.
No, of course. I'm just throwing it out there, these things, right? Because if anybody had any answers.
Yeah, and I think it's fantastic for the debate also. But just like starting from the last one, I think, I think we have a lot of studies about how the world is going wrong, and we need to, to give us as a task to try to find these cracks, and try to get out from this pessimism. So, and it's very hard. So in this research with Peter and also my research in Nicaragua, so we're trying to see, I think this counter-conducts, like when people, or referring to Foucault, when people, are not accepting things or not at this price, and then, it's like, this prefigurative politics that do not manage to crack the shell of the old world, but try to create a new world, in this shell. This is not my image. It's from Nagler. But anyway, so it's I think it's really important. It's because we don't know how they may they may be able to scale up, but still they show that something can be done even in this context. So I totally agree about the energy transition, and I think this is one of the like these are the type of ambiguities and contradictions and hypocritical politics that we need to highlight in our scholarship or in our activism, and try to find solutions. I think that it's like energy transition cannot go without degrowth, questioning growth, and then that's why also these alternative farming practices, in that sense, are prefigurative, because they're not based on this capitalist exploitative models and stuff like that. So I think they're really important. I know it's not a solution for big cities in China, but there are other ways. There are so many people also doing. I don't know much about urban farming and stuff like that. What I think is really important is that because you're talking about these compounded crises and how they interact. I think we've had enough studies about what is going to happen, and maybe our focus should not be about trying to predict the future and trying to tame uncertainty, but to put efforts in creating these affective relationships with other humans and non-humans that would help us to thrive under these new conditions that we can't predict, in whatever new conditions. But we don't have to be also super naive, because even when and this is what we talk about in our paper with Faith, that is that even these alternative emancipatory initiatives, they're exclusionary. There are always marginalizations happening, even in these efforts, in these emancipatory efforts. People are left behind. We interviewed fantastic people doing fantastic things concerning the land and agriculture and consumer-producer relations who are racist, or who vote far right. So everything is, and we shouldn't, these contradictions are really important to highlight, and how, and to work with. How can we account for the marginalizations we are creating in the process of building these new affective relations with other humans and non-humans? So yes, it's utopian, but isn't utopian, I think we need utopia. This is something we owe to our children.
In a way, I'm not so sure, because what it reminds me of, I used to go home to Northern Virginia to work, and she lives in a town called Oakton, where I think income is $200,000, and in her particular neighborhood, at least $500,000, and I would come from Hungary, from Budapest, which is a much grubbier place, and people certainly don't live like they do there. And I would hang out with friends, and on the weekend we would go to the farmers market, and everybody was eating organic and paid tremendous amounts of money at the local farmers market. I just thought, well, and we talk about how virtuous all of this was, and unironically, and I thought, well, yeah, in a way, it's kind of virtuous. It's like the elite, not the 1%, no, 0.1%, somewhere between 1 and 1.1%, living environmentally, partially environmentally better lives. This is like niche, like complete waste of time as well, right? And I'm sorry, I was extremely cynical, and so I thought this is a delusion, and I think that the thing is, you can't afford to be deluded, right? I think you have to just face kind of hard facts, and so don't provide hope when there isn't hope, but rather, when try to figure out how you mitigate, for instance, my mom's old neighborhood, well, yeah, how could those people be more? They could grow their own gardens, don't go to the farmer's market. you know, put some solar panels on the roof, get some people to live in the house, rent out some rooms for less than the market value. I mean, there's all sorts of things that, you know, could be done that would actually make some difference. Going to the farmer's market and eating organic, not that. So that, you know, so I think being kind of a cold-hearted realist is actually better than being a utopian or being idealistic. And, you know, in this world of AI and multiple crises and so on, you know, I don't know. I mean, certainly the authoritarian populism, well, authoritarianism in general is quite unpleasant. People often like it, and they like it under conditions, particularly of economic stress and uncertainty. I mean, that's one. Also, when they feel a threat, when there's some sort of external threat, or that you construct some sort of enemy, real or imagined, whatever, then authoritarianism can threat. And degrowth sounds to me like a recipe for more authoritarianism, more economic uncertainty. Like, yes, effective relationships between people can be a number. So, you know, but still, like, degrowth sounds to me like, well, you're just going to set things up for even more people like Trump and Orban or, you know, Bolsonaro and others who will come along and say, yeah, it's you live worse than your parents did, but I'm here to save the day for you.
Is it okay if I don't know?
Yes, let me, so now I think we've had a good response to our discussant. So now we can open the floor to other participants with their questions, and we can start with you. And I'll also look online. If anyone who's online would like to join the discussion, please raise your hand or put a question into the chat.
In true academic fashion, when I say a question, it's also a comment. But I think, first, I think it's really interesting work. And I like that you picked up a bit on these spaces or instances of resistance. And maybe it would be interesting, I don't know if that's the trajectory you're going through, but to pick up more on that. So kind of what you discussed in terms of communities in the cohort of isolating, and also in with kind of these alternative practices that are happening that form a sort of a resistance, and maybe naming it as such, because that was kind of what they stand for. And I think I agree that it's important. Like, there is an importance to look at some of this, like maybe utopia, maybe it is a sort of delusion, but I don't think that these alternative practices can push forward a more emancipatory way of life, include like farmers markets in the US. You know what I mean? Like, that is still very embedded in kind of certain relations of power and capitalist relations.
So no, I know that, but that was actually my point. And but I was saying, I was using it as an analogy, not as an example.
Yeah,
as an analogy of kind of being deluded about, you know, the reality.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's where we can kind of look at what, you know, there's regenerative art culture that's coming in, and it's coming in from the outside of certain communities because it's now a business opportunity, because it's a trend, because there's a market for it. And there's ones that there's maybe a lot smaller scale that's happening by people themselves. It's not named as such, but it is part of how they respond to, again, these oppressive forces and oppressive powers that encroaches on their space and encroaches on their environment. And I think within the environmental movements right now, there's so much importance to look at some of these nuances, because I mean, I work on Jordan, there's some similarity in the work, and you see investors coming from outside into lands with the claim that they're going to be doing work with the community, and then they hire the community that belong to traditionally. So I think, yeah, I wanted to kind of add on that, and also to look at the degrowth movement, to just a comment on degrowth, that there are movements that are forming resistance against states as well, and state intervention, that I think are still valid and very valid to look at, right? So because yes, there is this idea that degrowth can maybe allow more government interventions, but if it's coming from the philosophy or grounded in resistance to state control generally, then it should still work to avoid that capture. And because the status quo cannot continue, there are issues with how, what you mentioned about the energy transition, and kind of how continuing on that path also doesn't seem like it's very viable. What you said is so critical when we talk about where do the resources come from, right? Because those resources, land for solar panels, even land for excavation for these minerals, are displacing other people. So these continuous relations of power still exist, and these small seeds of resistance are trying to avoid being captured by that. And I think that we should kind of pay more attention to how they are attempting to do that. Thank you so much.
Okay. No, I think I agree, and we mentioned also, and this is also the question, the first question you asked about what are the sort of conditions that created the possibility for the authoritarian regime to develop, and I really did witness it over the years, and I told them I'm on the blacklist. I cannot go back, and I think if this could happen, that means for me that there was no democracy. There has never been a democracy. It has never been a democracy, and the same for Hungary. If the system has allowed Orbán to be in power, there has never been a democracy. And we talked also about the COVID, and I live in Sweden, and how Sweden managed the COVID the crisis. We're one of the only countries in Sweden that there was no lockdown, but one of the reasons was that, and there was no authoritarian backlash in the name of COVID, because one of the reasons is that there were, legally it was impossible to do it because of these legal provisions that the Swedish constitution had, that were put in place after the Second World War, so that they could not take such big decisions as closing down all the schools and and whatever. But that's still, if there are provisions like that, that means that democracy was working a little bit better than in all these countries, like including Canada, where in the name of COVID, authoritarian public health politics could be implemented. So yeah, that's and I agree. So that's that in relation to degrowth, as we need to think also about degrowth in relation to democracy, but that doesn't mean that the state cannot have an important role in promoting degrowth / democracy, and if there are provisions for that. Yeah.
I'm looking just to see, no one's raised their hand online. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you, and I'm sorry that I could make it only late.
Welcome.
Thank you, but I have two comments. One on degrowth. So it seems to me that if I understood the point that degrowth, it may generate some potential opportunities for, if I put it this way, negative populists who are building on frustrations. Some may argue address frustrations and try to respond to them. But I think that it seems to me that degrowth is necessary, and stopping or at least slowing down climate change is not reconcilable with worshipping economic growth. So as far as the happiness of humanity is measured by the yearly economic growth of the country, we don't have a chance to slow down climate change, it seems to me, except perhaps if some may hope that the economy can turn to be green to the extent that economic growth may be fine with stopping or slowing at least climate change. And the other big comment is that it's just about Hungary that and democracy, that it seems to me that it can happen like in Hungary, that after 89, we created a democracy, but in a tragic way, we couldn't build strong enough safeguards. So from 1990 to 1998, I was a member of parliament then, and I was part of it. And we put in the 2/3 majority laws, and the 2/3 majority of the votes in the House defended the Constitution and laws about fundamental rights like the media law. And as far as the current government didn't have 2/3 majority, they couldn't damage those things. So, of course, it's crucial that to what extent the spirit of the whole society was about to defend the limits on power by anyone. But still, there were these structural safeguards, and I think that just because these safeguards, as well as the fabric of the society, was not strong enough to defend democracy from damaging it to the extent it has been damaged so far, it doesn't mean that it was not a democracy. Thank you. I hope it makes sense.
Yeah.
Jay, would you like to react, or?
No, I think it's a very useful comment. Yeah.
So actually, I do have a couple of small questions, perhaps based on your presentation, that just came to my mind that I would ask you perhaps to react to. So there was a presentation here in the same room a couple of weeks ago. I think you were there, right? You saw that. And there was a lot of sort of pushback over defining terms. And you're talking about authoritarianism, you're talking about populism. And two examples that you give, I can see very fundamental differences between the two styles of authoritarian populism that you are discussing. So one question is, how do you, what's in common? What are the commonalities between these two systems that lead you to some definition of authoritarian populism that you're using? So that's the first. The second is, you talked about repoliticizing energy. And one of the things that we've been studying here in the department, where Alex and I teach, is securitizing and desecuritizing issues. So essentially, the balance between senses of ecological urgency, right, and taking certain issues out of the political field, in fact, and making them into security issues. And making them into security issues sometimes feeds into authoritarianism. So are you talking about, when you talk about repoliticizing energy, are you also talking about desecuritizing energy, taking it away from being considered to be a security issue and putting it back into kind of an ordinary political decision-making field? So that's my second question. And then the third one, you were talking about the cracks and how these energy-related issues sort of push into the cracks. It's like a wedge. And it just reminded, it's not really a question, but it just reminded me of what was happening in the 1980s prior to the transition in this region, in particular where we're sitting now, and how environmental issues were at that time a wedge issue, where people were able to agitate and secure certain rights and certain opportunities, which they normally couldn't have done before. And the reason being that there was a kind of a common consensus in society of the urgency of these issues. And that became a wedge, and then that created a crack which many groups that were not environmental jumped into. And then later, after the system was changed, they kind of all went back to their usual, they were not environmentalists anymore. But at least for that period of time, this was a serious wedge issue that created the momentum to really change society. So maybe you could react to those points.
Yeah, I think thanks, Steve. It's also very useful for me to think further about the commonalities. I think between Nicaragua and Hungary, I unfortunately see more commonalities than differences, and it's this creation of false binaries, enemies, the ambiguities behind these authoritarian politics, like all these contradictions, co-opting emancipatory claims. I feel it has been very strong in Nicaragua, and it's going to be increasingly strong here too. And this is why, last week's presentation, there was a discussion about left-wing, and you were here too, left-wing and right-wing populism. In my research, I don't find it useful. I believe in Nicaragua, who has been self-claimed as left-wing government, and I know quite well the Latin American so-called pink tide. This is what is really important is to see how these narratives are creating these false binaries, how they're trying to create social consent behind the politics, and trying also to give this example about the gender issues, legitimize the regime, not only internally but also externally. I can see it quite strongly also here in Hungary, and there's still quite some literature in environmental politics. How, for example, usually like far right voters are climate deniers and stuff, and climate change deniers. I think this is increasingly not true.
Is it true or not?
Not true. I think that the reality is blur. It's much more blurry, and that is very, very difficult for us. As who want to think about resistance, and it's what happened in Nicaragua with the gender equality policies. It's like how they've been instrumentalized also, and so before, when all the policies were gender blind, it was easy for us to say, we want, gender sensitive policies, you're all gender blind, and now it's just, we want gender equality, but not like this, not at this price, not with this understanding of gender, and so on. So this is much more difficult when you're trying to oppose the system. So I think this is so I see these commonalities, and increasingly with this complex world in which we are living, this blurriness, these ambiguities are going to be there. And some people say that Orban is playing double game, but it's also part of this, trying to blur things. I'm not truly familiar with the securitization, desecuritization issue, but what I would and I know there's a whole debate about that, but I think that like just everything is political. If you're taking even if you take it at a higher level, the question of climate change, it's a political move to do that. And then by political, what I mean is that it's power relations. We need to be aware, or to always look at not the power relations understood as the, in the end, like who is in power and who is less in power, but the processes through which power works, the workings of power, and how they create marginalizations, elite, and stuff like that. And also, what does the discourse of, or the practice of securitization, desecuritization do with the problem of climate change? So that's what I'm really not aware of the discussion. And the cracks, I totally agree. But you know what? The thing with the cracks and the environmental issue, the wedge and stuff like that. So if we are not, that's exactly my point. We don't know from where this resistance will be will come from, and from where we will be able to scale it up. So, for example, at that time, environmental issues became such a thing. But in Nicaragua in 2018, there was a social insurrection, and as a result of it, so they, under this very repressive system, it was just too much for the people when Ortega tried to change the social security system and mishandled some forest fire in this biosphere reserve of Indian Heights. We couldn't, everyone was hoping for such insurrection, the opposition, but it's impossible to predict. But if we keep an eye on what is happening in these places, we may be able. So this insurrection, unfortunately, was repressed, and there was even more repression after it. It was not successful, but we don't know where the spark is going to light the fire, and therefore, I think we need to have an eye on these, on these small initiatives that may have an emancipatory potential, maybe whatever, community-supported agriculture, environmental movements, whatever, feminist action.
Great. I'm looking one last time for anyone online, and I don't see any requests for the floor. And I'll give anyone here who'd like to have an opportunity for a last word, and of course you get the last word, but if anyone else wants to have anything to say at this point. Just great discussion. Thank you.
Maybe a last.
Yes, please.
Thank you. A last point that, but I think it's very important to be very critical on democracy in countries like the two in question now, and including my own country, Hungary, of course. At the same time, I think it's also very important to see issues in other countries. And I'm not saying it, and the whole thing is just a small footnote at the end, but I think it's important, and sorry, I don't want to take too much time, but the whole thing is not for, what I'm saying is, of course, not for saying that, okay, bad things start happening in other countries as well, it should be fine here too, or in Nicaragua. Of course, we should raise a high standard for all countries and democracies. But there are difficult issues elsewhere too, and part of what I think post-communist democracies faced here in Central East Europe was that, in a way, the picture was that this should be the model. This is how it should work in an ideal world. And then, if something bad happened, for example, there was a deal between members of the media council nominated by the current governing party and left-wing parties, and then the chairman of the media council in protest resigned. Although it was a rare moment that he was appointed at all, a fine constitutional lawyer, I'm saying that there are such fights in other. As a free speech scholar, I arrived to the US as a Fulbright fellow. I was looking at the Time Out in New York. I saw there is a pirate radio station in the Lower East Side. I was naive. I looked, what? Why a radio station is functioning as a pirate station in First Amendment land? And then I talked to my favorite First Amendment professor, and he said, not cynically, just in a descriptive way, that Peter, this country also has a power structure. And what happened there, and then I stopped, so I just quickly finish. What happened there, that then before Bill Clinton appointed someone for the head of the Federal Communications Commission, who had a plan to give frequencies, airwaves to thousands of local radio stations around the United States. But the National Association of Broadcasters, a commercial association, allied with the otherwise very good public service radio station, National Public Radio, successfully lobbied in Congress that those little stations would disturb their transmissions, and they were able to stop the plan. And part of my problem that if it's happening in Nicaragua or in Hungary, the narrative is that these countries are not real democracies, because it can happen here. And again, I'm not saying that these examples should justify any of these things in any democracy, but when we are looking at countries where democracy is more troubled, the structures are more fragile, where the fabric and spirit of democracy is weaker, we shouldn't use any double standard. It should not be still about there are those countries who had a more solid foundation for democracy, including more wealth, partly from slave trade and colonies. And I'm trying to say it not with frustration, but it's hard not to be angry about it in a way. So the same critical look should reach those countries as well. And sorry, I really finish here. Just to add another structural element. One example, I think the Leopold statues and streets and squares named after Leopold in Brussels. And he was responsible for the death and torture of many people in Belgian Congo. If statues of such person would be, for example, here in Hungary, the narrative would be that these people here in this former communist retarded country are not able to understand the spirit of equality and democracy and things like that. So I hope it was not unuseful. Like I'm saying, I think it's very important.
Yeah, I think it's really important having acknowledged that these so-called Western democracies are not the model to strive for, and which
in some way they are, and there is a lot to learn from there. But negative. Timothy Garton-Ash gave a talk here, like half year ago, and he said that negative stereotypes and prejudices about Central East Europe are still alive. You can look up his talk at Central European University, and that's very damaging.
Yeah.
Well, we are just a little over time, and I will actually, along the lines of what you just said, I mean, it was interesting for you to hear you say also that there are insurrections that were unfortunately repressed, because also we know there are insurrections that are fortunately repressed. Yes. So it's quite, that kind of fits in also with the perspective that you're looking at. And then I was also reminded of all the debates about the Western canon, which are also relevant to what you just mentioned. But I think we're now really out of time. And I want to say thank you. And I'm very happy you were the first person to give a talk here, to provide us with a seminar in the Environment Democracy Working Group. And thanks again. And we're going to be stopping the recording in a minute. The recording will be available for those who want to come back and check what we talked about today. But again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Very useful comments and questions.
And thanks to all the participants as well.